Hey everyone, it's Max here, and this is my new original story on the channel.
There is a letter in the Chicago Tribune archive dated June 15, 1894. It was written by a man named Thomas Heathcoate. He was a worker at the Pullman Palace Car Company in Pullman, Illinois, the factory town that George Pullman had built from scratch on the prairie south of Chicago, a town where his workers lived in houses his company owned, bought food at stores his company ran, went to church in a building his company allowed, and were paid in a combination of dollars and company scrip that was redeemable only at his company's establishments. Heathcote's letter is not angry. That is the thing about it that I keep returning to. It is precise. He describes specific numbers. He describes the deduction system that removed rent, store debt, and other company charges from wages before the paycheck was calculated. He describes the weeks, which had become frequent by the spring of 1894, as the depression that followed the panic of 1893 had led Pullman to cut wages without cutting rents or store prices, when the deductions exceeded the wages. He describes receiving a paycheck for 2 cents. He writes, with the precision of a man who has kept records, "We are born in a Pullman house, fed from the Pullman shop, taught in the Pullman school, catechized in the Pullman church, and when we die, we shall be buried in the Pullman cemetery and go to the Pullman hell." His letter appeared in the Tribune on June 15, 1894. 3 days later, workers at the Pullman plant walked off the job. The Pullman strike had begun. The letter's in the Chicago Tribune archive. It has been there since 1894. To understand why Heathcote was describing what he was describing, you need to understand what a company town was and how it worked, not as a general concept, but as a specific documented financial system whose mechanics are preserved in records at the Chicago History Museum and in the Federal Bureau of Labor reports at the National Archives. George Pullman began building his town in 1880, and the concept was genuine in its ambition. Pullman believed that workers who lived in clean, orderly, well-maintained housing would be more productive and more content than workers who lived in the slums of industrial Chicago. The town he built was, by the standards of 1880, extraordinarily well-designed. Brick row houses with indoor plumbing, a library, schools, a church, a hotel, an arcade of shops, a park, an artificial lake. It was also, from the first brick, a financial system designed to ensure that every dollar George Pullman paid his workers would return to George Pullman. The mechanics are documented in the Pullman Company records at the Chicago History Museum. The company owned every structure in the town. Rent was deducted directly from wages. The company store sold provisions at prices above what comparable goods cost in Chicago. The company held deposits on the housing that workers forfeited if they left. The library charged a fee. The church was a building that Pullman owned and rented to denominations at rates he set. The company's financial records, which the Chicago History Museum holds as part of the Pullman Company collection, show the specific revenue streams: housing revenue, store revenue, service fees, the financial architecture of a town where the company collected money from workers through every channel of daily life. The payroll records are in the same collection. They record week by week what each worker earned before deductions and what they received after deductions. In the Depression year of 1894, after Pullman had cut wages by between 25 and 40% without reducing rents or store prices, the gap between the two columns had become, for many workers, unbridgeable. When you place the payroll ledgers beside the store account ledgers, which is something the Chicago History Museum's collection makes possible because both are preserved in the same archive, the arithmetic becomes visible in a specific and documented way. A worker earning $1.25 a day for a 6-day week earned $7.50 before deductions. Rent was $2.25 per week for the smallest available housing. Store account for a family of 4 ran between $3.50 and $5 per week. The arithmetic of what remained, if anything, is in the records name by name, week by week. Some workers received net pay of 0, some received net pay of 2 cents. Heathcote's letter was not metaphor. It was arithmetic. The Federal Bureau of Labor had been documenting this system across American industry since its establishment in 1884. The Bureau's annual reports, which are in the National Archives under Record Group 257, contain detailed studies of the company town system in multiple industries. The 1885 report on mining communities in Pennsylvania and West Virginia is the most comprehensive early study. It documents wage rates, store prices, scrip systems, and the debt mechanisms that kept workers in permanent financial obligation to their employers. The 1885 Federal Bureau of Labor report is specific about the scrip system. Scrip was paper or metal currency issued by the company, redeemable only at the company store. Workers who needed cash before payday, which was typically monthly in mining operations, creating a permanent cash flow problem for families, could draw scrip against future wages. The scrip was redeemable at the company store at face value. Cash could sometimes be obtained for scrip, but at a discount. The company or a third party would exchange scrip for dollars at rates of 70 or 80 cents on the dollar. The 1885 report documents specific cases. Miners in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, whose monthly wages were entirely consumed by store account deductions before they received any cash. Miners who had worked for a company for years and owed the company money at the end of each year rather than accumulating savings. Families for whom the company store account was the only source of credit and the only place that credit was redeemable. The report has been in the National Archives since 1885. The arithmetic it documents is specific and verifiable. A family that depended on company store credit at prices above market rates, drawing against wages paid monthly, operating in a closed currency system, that family could not accumulate capital. The system was not designed to allow them to. Now, I want to tell you about the strike, because the strike is in the congressional record, and the congressional record shows what happened when workers tried to exit the system. The Pullman strike began on May 11, 1894, when workers walked off the job. By June, the American Railway Union, led by Eugene Debs, had voted to refuse to handle Pullman cars, effectively halting rail traffic across much of the country. The federal government, under President Grover Cleveland, obtained an injunction against the strike and deployed federal troops to enforce it. The intervention was legally unprecedented. The injunction against a labor strike under the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law that had been passed to break up corporate monopolies and was being used to break a union, was the specific legal innovation that the Pullman strike produced. The congressional investigation that followed produced testimony documenting the financial conditions in the Pullman town that had produced the strike. The testimony is in the congressional record for the 53rd Congress. It includes the specific paycheck amounts Heathcoate described, confirmed by the company's own payroll records entered as exhibits. The investigation's report acknowledged that workers had received paychecks for amounts as low as 2 cents after deductions. The report is in the congressional record. The 2-cent paycheck is documented not by the workers' testimony alone, but by the company's own records. Eugene Debs was convicted of contempt for defying the federal injunction and served 6 months in prison. He later said the experience turned him toward socialism. The Supreme Court upheld his conviction unanimously in re Debs, 158 U.S. 564, 1895. The strike ended. The Pullman Company resumed operations. The company town continued until 1907, when an Illinois Supreme Court ruling required Pullman to divest its residential properties on the grounds that owning a town was outside the scope of a manufacturing corporation's charter. The residential properties were sold. The workers who had been renting became tenants of new private landlords. The system that Heathcoate had described was not reformed, it was restructured. The Pullman Company records at the Chicago History Museum run to thousands of linear feet. The collection includes the payroll ledgers, the store account records, the rental records, the corporate correspondence, and the records of the 1894 strike. It is one of the most complete records of an American company town that exists in any archive. It has been at the Chicago History Museum since the company donated it in the mid-20th century. The finding aid is available through the museum's library. Researchers can request specific series. The payroll records and store account records are in separate series within the collection, which means that to see the arithmetic, to place what a worker earned beside what they owed, requires requesting both series and cross-referencing by worker name and by date. Nobody had systematically done this until labor historians began working with the collection in the 1970s and 1980s. Their findings, published in academic journals and collected in several books, confirmed what Heathcoate had described, that in the Depression year of 1894, after the wage cuts, the gap between earnings and deductions was frequently zero or negative for workers at the bottom of the pay scale. The records proved the letter. Now I want to tell you about the system beyond Pullman, because Pullman was famous, but it was not unique or even extreme. It was the company town that became publicly known because of the strike. Hundreds of others operated for decades without producing a strike large enough to generate congressional investigation. The coal towns of Appalachia are the most thoroughly documented. The Federal Bureau of Labor reports from the 1880s and 1890s studied coal communities in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky in detail. The reports are in the National Archives under Record Group 257. They document the scrip system, the company store prices, the monthly pay schedules that required workers to live on credit for 3 weeks out of 4, and the debt mechanisms that made it difficult or impossible for miners to leave. A miner who owed the company store could not leave without paying the debt. A miner who drew scrip against future wages had pledged those wages to the company before earning them. A miner who lived in company housing required company permission to have guests. A miner who organized or complained publicly could be evicted from company housing and fired simultaneously, losing income and shelter in a single action. The mechanism of control is documented in the Federal Bureau of Labor reports. It is not conspiracy. It is arithmetic. The reports lay out the arithmetic clearly. A family that cannot accumulate cash savings, that lives in housing it does not own, that buys food at prices it cannot negotiate, that is paid in currency that has no value outside one store, that family cannot leave. The system does not require violence or explicit coercion. The arithmetic is sufficient. I want to tell you about one specific detail in the Federal Bureau of Labor's 1885 report, because the detail is documented and because it illuminates something about the system that the general arithmetic does not fully convey. The report describes a mining community in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. The community's miners were paid monthly. The company store extended credit for the month between pay periods. The store's prices were between 15 and 20% above prices at comparable stores in the nearest city. The monthly wage, after deductions for store account, housing, and blacksmithing services, left most families with between $2 and $5 in cash per month. The report then documents something that the investigators found remarkable enough to note specifically. The company store sold life insurance, with premiums deducted from wages. The insurance was issued by a company related to the mine's owners. The premium was a fixed percentage of wages, the coverage was modest, and the claims process required documentation that many families found difficult to produce. The mining company collected insurance premiums from workers, paid those premiums to a related insurance company, and in cases of death, which were not infrequent in coal mining, controlled the claims process that determined whether the miner's family received the benefit. The Federal Bureau of Labor's investigators noted this in their report. They did not call it fraud. They described it as a practice that warranted examination. The practice is documented. The report has been in the National Archives since 1885. Now I want to tell you about the direct connection between the company-town system and the labor laws that exist today, because the connection is in the congressional record and it is direct and specific. The congressional investigation of the Pullman strike produced testimony and findings that influenced the subsequent legislative agenda on labor. The investigation's report, submitted in 1895, recommended specific changes to the legal framework governing labor relations, including the legality of injunctions in labor disputes and the rights of workers to organize. The recommendations were not immediately adopted, but they entered the legislative record. The Railway Labor Act of 1926 and the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, the law that established the legal framework for union organizing that still exists, Both drew on the findings and recommendations of the Pullman investigation and subsequent labor investigations in their legislative histories. The anti-scrip provisions in the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which required that wages be paid in legal tender rather than company currency, directly addressed the scrip system documented in the Federal Bureau of Labor reports. The Fair Labor Standards Act's legislative history, which is in the Congressional Committee records at the Library of Congress, references the Federal Bureau of Labor Studies. The 1885 report documenting the Westmoreland County mining community's scrip system contributed, through several decades of legislative history, to the law that made the scrip system illegal. The report was written in 1885. The law that addressed what it documented was passed in 1938. 53 years. In those 53 years, the Federal Bureau of Labor documented the system continuing and expanding. The reports are in the National Archives. They are specific, year by year, industry by industry. They are the documentary record of a system that operated for half a century after it was first documented as harmful, and that ended not because it was exposed, but because legislation eventually made its core mechanisms illegal. Now I want to tell you how to find out if your ancestor lived in one of these towns, because this is the personal connection that makes the documented history relevant to you specifically. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the successor to the Federal Bureau of Labor, published lists of company towns and company store operations as part of its industrial surveys from the 1880s through the 1920s. These lists are in the National Archives under Record Group 257. They name specific communities, specific companies, and specific states. If your family worked in coal mining in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, or Alabama before 1938, the year the scrip system was made illegal, there's a significant probability that the community they worked in was a company town. The coal industry was the most extensively documented sector in the Federal Bureau of Labor reports. If your family worked in textile mills in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, or Alabama, the mill village system was a variant of the company town that has been documented in both the Federal Bureau of Labor reports and in the records of the National Labor Relations Board, which are at the National Archives under Record Group 25. If your family worked on the railroads, in the maintenance of way crews that actually lived in railroad towns along the lines, the railroad company records, many of which are at the Baker Library at Harvard Business School or in state historical societies, may document the housing and store arrangements. Heathcote's letter is in the Chicago Tribune archive. The payroll records that confirm his arithmetic are at the Chicago History Museum. The Federal Bureau of Labor reports documenting the same system across hundreds of communities are in the National Archives. The receipts survived. The records show, name by name, week by week, how the system worked and what it cost the people who lived inside it. The 2-cent paycheck is in the Pullman Company records. Heathcote wrote about it 3 days before the strike. The congressional record confirmed it when the company's own books were entered as evidence. He worked all week. His check said 2 cents. The records were always there. The Pullman Company records, including payroll ledgers and company store accounts, are at the Chicago History Museum. The collection is available to researchers by appointment. The finding aid is available through the museum's library catalog. The payroll records and store account records are in separate series and must be requested together to cross-reference worker earnings and deductions. The Federal Bureau of Labor annual reports from 1885 through the early 20th century are in the National Archives under Record Group 257. The 1885 report on mining communities is the most comprehensive early study of the company store and scrip system. The finding aid is available through archives.gov. The congressional record for the 53rd Congress contains the testimony and findings of the Pullman strike investigation. The company's own payroll records were entered as exhibits, confirming the net pay amounts Heathcote described, available through the Library of Congress Congressional Record System. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 legislative history, including committee reports referencing the Federal Bureau of Labor Studies of the scrip system, is in congressional committee records at the Library of Congress. If your family worked in coal mining, textile mills, or railroad construction before 1938, The Federal Bureau of Labor reports may name their community specifically. The reports are organized by state and by industry. The letter is in the Tribune archive. The ledgers are at the Chicago History Museum. The federal reports are in the National Archives. All of it has been available since the 1890s. Subscribe, because next week we open another file.